Pastor's Heart and Dominic Steele here, and in a moment Gary Hoag. Gary's a leader in the area of, professional advice for ministry leaders, governance, ministry finances, and he blogs at thegenerositymonk.com. Look, just a note, we'd love to get your feedback on the Pastor's Heart. You could make a comment on Facebook under the particular post of each episode, or on YouTube, or on our thepastorsheart.net page. If you'd like to subscribe and you're on the Apple device, just type into your browser bit.ly/thepastorsapple, or on the Android device bit.ly/thepastorsandroid, or to subscribe on YouTube it is bit.ly/thepastorsyouTube. Now, Gary Hoag, welcome to Sydney.
Thank you so much.
It's great to have you with us. Thanks for coming in. We've got big problems under money in the Christian church. What's wrong? And I'm defining Christian big, wide. Some of it I wouldn't even be comfortable calling Christian. Yeah.
So first, I want to own the responsibility. Yeah. So I teach as a visiting professor at 7 seminaries in 4 countries, because we haven't talked much about money in the seminary setting.
Yeah.
Though it was a pretty popular topic for Jesus.
Yeah.
So I want to speak not from a place of finger pointing, but own that we've not done a good job at the seminary level. Now, that said, when it's been taught, because we haven't done a very good job at it, it's often led people kind of 4 places, I like to say. First is if we take Old Testament covenant promises out of context, so we're like not rightly dividing the word of truth.
Yeah.
If we look at the money passages in the Old Testament that were proclaimed to God's people Israel, and we apply them to us today, that leads to what's commonly known as prosperity gospel.
Yeah.
So in other words, have you ever been driving somewhere and you got off track and you want to know how you got off track? If you want to, the wrong road you take to end up in prosperity gospel is taking Old Testament covenant promises out of context. You'll end up there every time.
How do they do it?
That's how they do it. They literally, Deuteronomy 28. If you do this, if you follow my commands, your bread's going to rise, your calves are going to drop, you're going to be the head and not the tail, all these things are going to happen. And then they tell people, look, if you do all these things, this is going to happen for you. And you want your breakthrough to happen. And then that's what they proclaim. And so I'm saying that you'll end up prosperity gospel every time. And there's nothing.
It's a different Jesus, isn't it?
Oh, it's not a gospel at all. Because it's not good news, because it actually sends people to a place of really a place of thinking that they're the ones who are trying to make some temporal results happen. That's the first area that disgusts me. The second area is, first one's prosperity, second one's slavery. So if you look at Old Testament and New Testament, in America, we have a sandwich. I think you guys maybe we would take peanut butter and jelly, put them together. Maybe yours is Vegemite or something. But peanut butter and jelly, those two make a great sandwich. Putting them together is like taking the law in this hand and the gospel of grace in this hand. And that, according to Galatians, sends us back to slavery. And so if we look at, say, tithe teaching in the Old Testament, first of all, in the Old Testament, the tithe was 3 tithes. You had the first tithe that went to God. So what would that do? That would connect us to God. The second tithe was for the festivals. And notice that connects us with each other. Yeah. Deuteronomic scholar Gordon McConville at the University of Gloucestershire taught me that giving, that second tithe, was the glue in the community. Then the third tithe, that was every 3 years, they'd bring a third tithe for the aliens and the strangers and the Levites who had no land on which to grow things, right? And that would care for God's servants and the needy among them. And so notice, the Deuteronomic law is intended to teach us to be connected to God and one another through our giving. But as we move into the New Testament, we don't see Jesus with disciples ever using tithe language. Why? It's law language. It would send us back to slavery. And I mean, that's my own story. Like growing up, my pastor taught tithe, so I ticked off the box, and then I was prideful. And then I thought the other 90% was mine, and I became just like the religious leaders, a greedy lover of money. And so when I say that if you teach the tithe, you're really sending people back to slavery. Two more. First, prosperity. Second, slavery. Third, I'm going to say, so there's assonance, culturally. If you're proclaiming a message that sounds good culturally, it's probably another gospel. In other words, oh yeah, like giving becomes all about give to the things you care about. Now that would be great if I was the owner of those resources, but the reality is I'm only a steward. They're God's resources. So we need to give to the things that God cares about. The money we possess is not ours. So I tell people in the words of Richard Foster, your giving shouldn't be, oh, how much of my money should I give to God? That's the cultural message. It should be, how much of God's money do I need to keep for myself?
So why is it that the big churches are the prosperity churches?
The message sounds awesome. And so it attracts the masses. And it generally attracts people who aren't very deep or astute theologically. And so they drink it up. I mean, I was filmed one time by the local TV news because one of the prosperity gospel that was on preachers that was on television in Denver, Colorado, a scam was found out, and so they came to Denver Seminary where I was vice president, and they filmed me. And you know how they'll film you for like 30 minutes, and then you're on the 6 o'clock news that night for
6 seconds.
6 seconds. Here was my 6 seconds. If someone's proclaiming something that only God can deliver, they're probably a spiritual snake oil salesman who duped you into buying what they were offering. In other words, I made some funny line about a snake oil salesman in the old Wild West back in the day. They would sell you something that sounded real good, like this elixir can solve all your problems. And that's what's happening. They're snake oil salesmen. They're selling something that, oh, if you just do this, everything's going to be great. That's not the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so when they're promoting that to people who don't really know any better, they're leading them astray.
And yet it feels in places like the center of gravity of Christianity has moved from, if you like, the Bible guys, the evangelical guys, to the Pentecostal prosperity guy.
Which is why I took you back to, remember, you're seeing a lot of prosperity, a lot of slavery, a lot of culture, stuff that sounds good culturally. We got to get to generosity. Generosity is a fruit of the Spirit, agathosune. So I love the NRSV translation of Galatians 5:22 and 23. It says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity. And so watch, if we're focused on faithfulness, we're focused on helping people abide in the vine so there's fruit on the branches. One of those fruits is going to be generosity. And so I get people to shift their attention back to, you focus on building faithful people, having people doing faithful activities. The fruit will take care of itself.
So what's your word to me, the pastor, in a city where just down the road we have big Pentecostal prosperity church? How do I handle it?
So I'm going to answer it in a way that maybe you wouldn't expect. So think with me. When God's people were in captivity in the scriptures, what did courageous people do? I would equate you with Ezra in this situation. You're a teacher of the word. You want people following God's design. So what does Ezra do when the people are in captivity? He fasts, he prays, and he confesses. I would say if you're in a setting where a lot of people are being duped into believing the wrong thing, they're really in captivity. And so to help them find their way to freedom, you keep confessing and proclaiming what is true. And you keep focusing on prayer and focus on fasting.
It's very interesting. Thinking that I think in this city we've seen the prosperity Pentecostal make a lot of money and draw a lot of people, And then the Bible guys have reacted saying, I don't want to be that guy.
Sure.
And they've kind of done what you've talked about.
And
there.
notice what you just said. They focused on not being them.
Yes, not being them.
That's right. And that's not what your focus is, because you don't answer to the audience. See, the problem with both sides is you're playing to an audience, the wrong audience, an audience of humans. It really, ready for this? Not only should you not care what the humans think, you can't care. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because they're not the one to whom you answer. So your focus, if you're a pastor of a big church, small church, you got whoever down the street, you focus on who you need to be, what you need to be, and you're going to be known by your fruits.
One of your concerns is that as we look for outcomes in ministry, we could be looking for the wrong things. What do you mean by that?
Sure. There's a common question, and that question sends us down a predictable path. The question is, how do we define success? So for pastors, they could be tempted to define success based on numbers. Think of the numbers, like how many people are attending the services, how many listeners are tuning in to their sermons online, how large their buildings are, how big their budget is. And these are figures we tend to affix success to success, when in reality, I think God's word points to something very different in success.
But you do have to look at those numbers, though, don't you? I mean, because you do have to look at, can we grow the budget or not grow the budget?
So think of it this way. In the early church in Acts, it says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, the breaking of bread, and prayer. So think of those as the faithful activities. And then it says, and the Lord added to their number daily those that were being saved. So the outcomes came after the faithful activities. And so what people tend to do is think, how do I just create the outcomes? And what they should be focusing on is, what are the faithful activities?
Okay, faithful activities. I mean, would you use the word inputs there?
Sure.
So what do you do?
So think of it this way, at least if I were to answer your question in the church context. I charge pastors and elders to sit down and say, what are the faithful things that we want everyone in our congregation doing? So we need to be the ones to model that. And when they do that, they create a congregation of disciples that mirrors the activity there. Mirrors what they are doing. Think of it in terms of the fact that we find ourselves in a time when a lot of pastors are crying out and saying, I've got nothing but a large congregation of passive consumers of the gospel. Largely what I've seen in pastors who've read my book, The Choice, they've come back and said that church for them had devolved from doing faithful activities and trusting God for results to trying to create something that would create results. And so their focus was, how do they use lights and smoke and mirrors maybe to create a 75-minute production that has 3 showings on a weekend. And so the pastor says, my role has shifted from shepherd to producer.
Yep.
When that happens, they're going to produce really just passive consumers who go to be entertained or to just consume what they've produced. Instead, when they make a list of the faithful activities that they need to be found doing, what happens is they find the congregation doing those things, because you'll do what the pastor and the lay leaders are doing. You'll follow their example.
So you're critiquing that. I mean, it seems like it's a major phenomenon in the American church at that point.
I would say so.
Yeah.
When you think about, at least in the local church setting, when you think about how you define and measure success, if you measure it based on numbers, you're going to focus on just trying to create results rather than trying to create disciples.
And you're saying we want to put our focus onto disciples and discipling. How do we do that?
So let me go back to, with pastors, I encourage them to make a list of the faithful activities they need to be doing.
Yeah.
When the pastor and the elders make a list of these faithful activities, I'll give some examples.
Yeah.
Sure, preaching the word is one pastor say, oh, got that, tick that box. But then it's things like weeping with those who weep. Many pastors find themselves so busy they don't have time to be with people. And so what they're doing is creating a congregation of people who don't have time for other people.
Yeah.
And so when we make people a priority, or that is maybe one of a list of faithful activities, we create a congregation that lives along those lines. I'll give another example. Things like practicing hospitality, things like devoting yourselves to specific disciple-making efforts. A lot of times what we've done at least in the American church, is we've specialized things. So we've said, well, someone else is doing that, and someone else is doing that. And so what we've done is we've basically created people who have a very limited understanding of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, because they don't see role models in their church just simply doing the faithful activities that Jesus asks of disciples. Think of it this way. When Jesus gave what we call the Great Commission, he didn't quantify it. He didn't say, Dominic, go make 100 disciples. I mean, that would be like defining success based on numbers. He didn't say, go make 200 disciples. He didn't quantify it. He qualified it. He said, Dominic, go make disciples and teach them everything I commanded you.
Yeah.
So our focus, at least the pastors I've worked with regard to this book, The Choice, our focus has shifted from how do we produce numbers and outcomes to what are the faithful activities and how are we making sure we're building faithful people. And if we do that, how we build them is how they'll build others. And it actually creates the multiplication you're looking for.
And you've seen that? You've seen.
A good example would be a church in Andover, Minnesota. The pastor is a good friend of mine, Randy Disher. When he read the book, The Choice, he was convicted. He was convicted because while his church had grown to over 2,000 people, it was largely 2,000 passive consumers of the gospel. And they really weren't actively engaged in making other disciples. They were just coming, open up and say and being like spoon-fed on a Sunday. Instead, he and his elders decided there's 12 months in a year, so we're going to map out 12 faithful activities. We're going to do these faithful activities, and we're going to focus on one a month. Let me give you another example. Fasting and prayer. So Randy said when they made their list of faithful activities, he realized he hadn't fasted or prayed for the lost in his city for a long time. And so they shifted as an elder board to how can we be a congregation that fasts and prays for the lost and the least. They decided it's got to come out of the leadership.
Yeah.
And so they reasoned that they need to be people of fasting and prayer. When that happened, the congregation followed suit. So I go back to my basic kind of comment I made at the beginning is the choice intersects with the church when we just say, what are the faithful things I need to be doing? No matter what the results are, I'm going to be found doing those things, because fruitfulness always is a product of faithfulness. You'll never see fruit on the vine if you're not abiding in the vine. Like, you're never going to see fruit on the branches. Yeah. And so I tell pastors, if you're focusing on doing the faithful activities, the fruit will take care of itself.
Why then do we have pastors who actually have spent years and years and years being super faithful and still pastoring the same small group?
You know, when I read, first of all, when I read some biblical narratives, like say Jeremiah, why does someone toil for so long and see so little fruit? And the answer is God's desire for him or for that pastor of the small church is not numbers. God's desire is faithfulness. And so sometimes faithfulness means you're going to toil for a long time and not see a lot of fruit. So following the kingdom path, as we call it, it positions you for enduring suffering and for sustainability. I didn't say it positions you to have numbers that were always going to be up and to the right. God's design actually, at least in the New Testament early church, is often that faithfulness will lead to things like persecution.
Yep.
And so it's actually our faithfulness that helps us navigate and make it through difficult times like persecution. And so I say focus on faithfulness, and you're bound to experience difficulty, and God will sustain you through that, because you will have The ones who focus on faithfulness, they see God.
Mm-hmm.
They see him show up because he's there. He is their safety. He is the rope they're holding on to. And so they learn through the experience of trusting him and journeying with him that he can be counted on. Even if they're praying for a long time to see some kind of fruits.
Yeah.
And
your concern, I think, is that, particularly in America, but also here, the pastor's drunk too deeply from the American business model. Is that right?
Undoubtedly. So I teach a doctoral course at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, a DMin course, and I've had students from Australia.
Yep.
So one of my students, he's from pastors a church in Toongabbie.
Yep.
I like saying the word because it's one of the cool Aborigines words. And he's had me even come preach at his church in Toongabbie. And he said to me, that's precisely it. He's like, we've followed a lot of these secular messages that tell us that if we do certain things, we're going to see certain results, as if they're like formulaic, like some magic formula. And nowhere in the scriptures are we called to implement some formula to produce some result. We're called to do faithful activities and to just impart that which was imparted to us, so that when growth happens, God gets the glory.
Because otherwise it ends up pointing at you.
That's right.
And your skill.
It's like, look how awesome. I implemented this fad or this strategy and it exploded with growth. And it reminds me, when I hear that, I love the parable of the sower. It reminds me of that fruit that sprouts up, but because it doesn't have roots, it withers. And I think there's a lot of rocks, using the parable of the soils. There's a lot of churches that have rocks. They've got issues. Until they remove those, they're not going to see fruit that lasts, that sprouts and has deep roots. Because the faithful activities are going to give you your deep roots. The magic formulas, they're going to give you your quick sprout and no long-term fruit.
So is there any place for setting a goal or a target then?
So let me answer that by taking you to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Picture you're listening to the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard what is said, but I say to you. We get the Beatitudes, and then Jesus reframes everything in their minds. And then when you fast, when you pray, when you give alms, the Matthew 6. When you get to Matthew 7, Jesus rocks their world and reminds you, if you need something, ask the Father. And then he says, a lot of people are going to take a wide path, and a few people are going to take a narrow path. And you're going to know them by their fruits. But then he says, like these people who take this wide path, it's as if they're going to meet him someday and go, Lord, Lord, we did all these things for you. Look at all this stuff we did. We don't serve a deficient God who needs us to do anything for him. He's looking for people willing to give themselves, to surrender themselves to allowing him to work through them.
Yeah.
And so to those that say, look at all this stuff we did for you, he's going to say 2 words, but they're not going to be well done, good and faithful servant. They're going to be, go away. I mean, literally, go away. I never knew you. He's looking for people who want to know him deeply. And so in going back to, like, how does that answer your question? We are ministering in a time when many people think, especially in pastoral ministry, they think, I've got to produce some kind of results to keep my job. I've got to produce some kind of results so people will like and accept me. So they're living and serving for the wrong audience. And so if you're a pastor, like out there, like if you're a pastor and you're laboring and you're toiling and you're thinking, how do I see some kind of results in fruit? Go back to the faithful activities. Fast and pray for your people. Study and deliver the word and make sure it's true in your life first. Because what most places where 30, 60, 100-fold fruit happens, it's where the walk and talk of the leader match. Where they're looking at them and say, this person's authentic. This person's the real deal, as we say in America. And so I wouldn't be focused on results. I wouldn't be focused on those things that most people focus on.
there's no place for plundering the Egyptians on organising the leadership pipeline, any of those kind of things?
The question about gaining stuff from modern day research. I'm all about research. I mean,
yeah,
I have a PhD. Like I love research. The difference is, here's where people I think go wrong versus in the choice book and what I call the common path of the kingdom path. On the common path, we hire production-driven leaders to implement these growth or expansion-focused strategies, right? And it's as if we do this. We say, God, you began a good work at my church, and I'll take it from here.
Yes.
And it's as if we grab the wheel. And here's what happens. Once you grab the wheel, you're saying the power flows through you. And once you grab that wheel, you're shifting to, all I need is money to make this ministry happen. So you're going to just do whatever's necessary to get money to flow in. And you're not even going to realize it, but you're going to become just like your religious leaders, and you're going to be a greedy lover of money. And you're saying, wait a minute, Gary, I'm not a lover of money. And when I was in my doctoral researching that a lover of money isn't someone who's a greedy Wall Street tycoon. It's someone who thinks money is what makes things happen. And there's people out there who think, oh, all I need is money to make things happen. And what I'm telling you is, on that common path, we take the wheel, and then all we need to drive the ship is more money to come in. And we have shifted to, just like the religious leaders allowing money changers and merchants in the temple, we have shifted to making sure things work so enough money comes in to keep things going. And that's not God's design for fruitful ministry. Instead, what does the kingdom path look like? It looks like people who say, we're going to be steward leaders who implement faithfulness-focused strategies. So our focus is faithfulness. So sure, I might do research on assimilation, or I might do research on how do I best serve people when they come in. But when it comes to churches who tell me, hey, well, we need to come up with other revenue models because giving has gone down, my answer to them is, I think growing in the grace of giving was important in the first century, and it's important today. So if giving's going down, we need to focus on what are the faithful activities we can be doing to be growing givers, just like we grow people in other aspects of the faith.
Yeah, so that makes sense. I mean, you want people to be properly converted in holiness, properly converted in their wallets, in all areas of life.
Exactly.
And growing in holiness, growing in generosity. Yeah.
Right, so do you notice how at every turn where I'm pushing you? I'm pushing you back to the only thing that's required of stewards of mysteries of the gospel, 1 Corinthians 4, 1 and 2. It's faithfulness.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. So, I mean, this week, we've had our church council meeting where we've worked on the budget. I had 2-3 hours sitting with 7 people as we scratched our heads about, is this a reasonable target for next year? Is it too high? Is it too low? Can we afford to do this? Can we not afford to do that? How are you saying I should do it differently?
Sure. By the way, I love the humility and transparency with which you ask the question. And what I would say with the same transparency back is I like to not even call it a budget. I like to call it a spending plan. Watch. I'm a CEO of an organization, and we don't spend money we don't have, and you're a steward of what you do have. And so as God supplies, we come up with a spending plan that is faithful to God's design for these resources. And so it looks similar, but when you look at that plan for the next year, first I like to start with not spending money I don't have. And so we like to have resources in advance of spending them versus how much do we think might come in. Does that make sense?
It's so radical that I'm struggling in that. I mean, we run with just a week or two's money in the bank, or it's great if we've got a month's money in the bank. Okay. But we do know, but we have asked people to make a pledge, for the next year.
Okay.
So in our vision season, we're going through we're working on the budget. Then we can ask people to make a pledge, and then they'll make a pledge, and then we'll either do or not do that budget. Yeah.
Well, so that's great.
Right. Okay.
What I'm telling you though is when when your people have come together and prayed and set forth what they believe God's calling them to contribute.
So we'll have that in November.
Okay, so based on how He's supplied to them, they're saying it's X amount of dollars.
Yeah,
I'm saying
until we get those forms in. Yeah,
this becomes okay. What's our spending plan
Is
to
based on
faithfully put to work what we believe God is going to supply?
Gotcha. I think I misunderstood before when you said only spend what you have. I thought, hang on, we haven't got any money, but we will have, and the people will have pledged.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, I'm CEO of a new organization, and so we don't even have constituents necessarily that would make pledges. And so, one of the efforts that I did in the first 6 months was literally raising the first year's budget.
Yeah.
So that as we got into the first year, we're really looking ahead at the second year's budget.
Yeah.
And so we're just trying to faithfully put to work what we have because, and this is, I think, true of pretty much any ministry. Ready? We don't know the future.
No.
So we come up with a plan after prayer and discernment this is how we think God's leading us to put it to work. So it requires fasting and it requires, a time of prayer and discernment, and you say, okay, this is kind of how the direction we believe God's leading us, and this is how we're going to deploy His resources. But I would probably, and I'm assuming this happens, maybe on a quarterly basis, you're reevaluating it, and you're saying, okay, we were sensing this direction, and how do we need to reevaluate it? But I don't necessarily think you're doing anything right or wrong, doing anything wrong. I think what I'm challenging you to do is think of that word budget. Think of that as what's our plan to faithfully put to work what we believe God has supplied. And in the words of the famous Adoniram Judson, it's true we might want more, but let's use what we have faithfully and trust God to supply more.
Now, what about setting forward a vision? Do you think that's a good...
Sure.
I mean, and setting forward some outcomes that you're hoping might happen?
Okay, so I get a little nervous on the outcomes part.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. The organization GTP, we've helped establish peer accountability groups like the CMA Standards Council in Australia in 7 countries. Okay?
Yeah.
So if you said to me, Gary, can you deliver 2 more countries this year?
Yeah.
Can I control that? The answer is no. So that's not an outcome I'm going to promise. But if they say to me, Gary, are you going to visit the 12 regions of the world? We've kind of divided the world into the 12 regions of Lausanne. And I'll visit key workers in these 12 regions and serve those that are receptive. Can I do the faithful work of visiting these places and delivering teaching? Yes, I can do that.
Yeah.
Now, can I promise any results? No. But what I can say at the end of the year is I can report that we delivered training to so many thousand people from so many countries.
Gary Hoag, thanks very much for being with us.
My privilege.
My guest on The Pastor's Heart has been Gary Hoag, and you can find him at thegenerositymonk.com.